So I'm arguing for pessimism.
Okay. Well, Merry Christmas to all those.
Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas. There's Daniel. Back for another episode. How are you this morning, Daniel?
I'm doing well. Doing pretty well. Thank you.
Good.
I do have one caution, though, as we move into this Christmas season.
Okay.
Yeah, for any, those who drink coffee or, just, special drinks or snacks out there, it always seems like peppermint would be a good flavor, of whatever, peppermint chocolate or something, maybe peppermint coffee. My wife just recently bought, we make smoothies regularly, almost daily, have for breakfast. And we typically use like a chocolate, it's a non-dairy, what do you call it? Anyway, it's like a non-dairy protein mix, And so we use that. Well, she got on the site and they had like a peppermint or a peppermint chocolate flavored protein mix. I mean, man, that sounds great. And maybe even like a hot chocolate option or something like that. Don't do it. Yeah. If you see a peppermint protein mix, don't do
Peppermint protein mix.
Yeah, it sort of tastes like yuck with an aftertaste of meh. It's just, and that was even like mixed with some of the chocolate. But it was, oh boy.
Okay.
It wasn't exactly fit for consumption. It wasn't. It was sort of like after you tasted it, it was like, oh my goodness, this is gross. And then you're like, oh, I could sort of see where that could maybe be peppermint. Yeah. It was that kind of taste.
Normally, anyway, I'd be a fan of chocolate and peppermint. I used to like that.
Yeah,
Andy's candies.
But that
those
particular,
were the best.
Oh my goodness, those are fantastic. Yeah, but so not everything peppermint. I'm just saying that thing. If you see like a peppermint smoothie protein mix, maybe go. No, I'm not sure.
Hard pass.
They can do that. But that being said, we want to thank our patrons over at patreon.com/reason together. You like that segue there?
I know. I was just getting ready to point out the utter disjointedness of that segue, if you can even call it that. That's like the definition of a non sequitur, right? On that note, cheese is wonderful. It just doesn't follow. So,
right.
But as you were,
but it's. Yeah, okay. I had to maybe take more time working on the transitions there. Oh goodness. Okay, well, patrons, thank you very much for your support of this episode and this podcast on an episode by episode basis. And come on, get with it, man. Keep it together, man.
I almost inhaled my coffee.
Okay. So anyway, now let's since we're like disjointed, let's just slam into some questions.
Yes. But thank you, patrons. We do appreciate you. It bears mentioning. We need spontaneous commercial here. We need more patrons. I'll just come out and say it. And we know that there are a lot of folks that listen to this podcast that aren't patrons yet. Come on, people. We'd love to have you.
Our show.
Yeah, we'd love to have you on board with the patron family. And it's not expensive. You can do it very affordably. We have several different tiers you can choose from based on how much you'd like to contribute. And there are perks available with each of those tiers. I know you've heard us say this 1,000 times. Patreon.com/reason together. But the 1,001st time, go ahead and type that into your browser and click go, and sign up for one of those patron levels. We'd love to have you on board. We've got exciting things planned here for the blog. We've got articles in the queue, just about ready to go, I think, and we're excited to keep things moving. We'd love to be able to, start doing a little more with the blog and with a few other things, and your support would help immensely. So patreon.com/reason together and become part of the patron family.
Thank you. And I was going to say, I just wanted to highlight that recently we posted a blog post on the nature of a good
Mm-hmm.
gift, and we would think that the definition of a gift is basically buying, freely giving something to someone that they like. But I think that needs to be adjusted, and that's what that article deals with.
Interesting.
We need to modify that consideration. What actually is a good gift? Okay.
Yeah, look forward to that.
So we have a few questions here. Which do you have a preference? What we kind of?
Yeah, let's see
Yep.
here. This one. I don't know. We want to start with that one. That would be kind of heavy to start with. Let's start out. Let's start out with the "Let's Go Brandon" question.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sure. So I'm sure our listeners are likely somewhat aware of a phrase that's been going around now for some
Mm-hmm.
time, chanting "Let's go, Brandon." Of course, the history of that being that when a man named Brandon, I don't remember his last name, was it
Yeah,
NASCAR,
NASCAR.
won a race. People while he's being interviewed, people in the stands apparently are chanting no, they're chanting F Joe
Mm-hmm.
Biden, uh, except not using just the
The
letter F.
expletive, yes.
Yes, and so the person doing the interview says, "Oh, they're saying let's go, Brandon." Either because she wants to cover for it or whatever. And so it seemed apparently to some people, I guess, that it was obvious what was being said, and she was just sort of spinning it to say, "Well, they're actually just cheering on this man that I'm interviewing." And so that became sort of a funny meme, in a sense, if you will, that as an overlay of what someone could say in a more vile way, they could say "Let's go, Brandon," and that expressed their utter disdain for the current president of the United States. And I was just recently, I kind of brought that into a discussion in a Sunday school class, um, by the fact, we can talk about kind of generalities of what does it mean to, walk in the way of light, and you see things from God's perspective and things like that, um, biblical wisdom. But when we come to it, so I pulled out an application like this, and basically just brought it down that if you step back and you say, what does it mean? What does the F bomb mean? Um, and you realize how crass and even vile that is, how detestable that is. And though over time, you're going to read maybe different stories of what it means or where it came from, I think the current understanding for those who don't just thoughtlessly say it, but the actual meaning of the word in more contemporary past, is something I would suppose that technically can't be done to a man, but it still expresses that kind of that desire that he would be, if you will, overpowered and de-virginized, that kind
Yeah,
of thing. So
physically violated.
physically violent, that's good. And so it expresses an utter contempt for someone to the point that you wish that something nasty and awful happened to them. And so if you recognize what that word means, and words mean things, then of course the phrase, F Joe Biden, is horribly inappropriate for a believer.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is the case, then if "Let's go, Brandon" means the same thing, um, it's way more than just a Christian cuss word. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
it it's just something not at all appropriate in the language of a Christian, and that's kind of what I was bringing up.
Sure. Yeah. No, I tend to agree with you. I don't go around saying, "Let's go, Brandon." I don't really promote the use of it. I don't think it's a great idea. But some Christians would argue that that is a way of sanitizing it, that they have taken it and changed it into something that isn't the word itself. And I think for that reason, there are some Christians who are all too excited to say it, because it's like, their flesh is saying, well, now I get a chance to curse and say what I really want without actually doing it. And to me, there's
Hmm.
something wrong with the heart attitude that wants to do that
With that
anyway.
too. Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it is still carrying the sentiment. And while I realize you can take that too far, to where, well, this means this, and then that means something else, and then that means something else. So you can't say that now. And you're now 4 layers deep to
Right.
things you
Right.
can't say. I realize you can take that too far, but I think this one lives pretty close to home here. The phrase is pretty well
Yeah.
connected, and I think it would be prudent to not use the phrase if at all possible.
And it's good to know that I'm not saying you can't disagree with the
Right.
president or that you can't verbalize that you think his policies are awful or that his character is distasteful or whatever. But it kind of harkening back to, I don't know, a few episodes ago, talking about articulation.
Hmm.
You can actually have a vocabulary that in um, regular English terms expresses disdain
Hmm.
without being vile
Sure.
and crass and
Yeah.
wishing harm to the man's person. There you can actually say it if you have a
Well,
vocabulary. So,
yeah, here's even a biblical example, right? Um, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for thou
mm,
sittest to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law. This is an example
yeah,
from the life of the Apostle Paul, when the high
yeah,
priest commanded him to be smitten on the mouth, in Acts chapter 23. And he was smitten on the mouth, and his response was calling the man a whited wall, which in
hmm,
my understanding of that, and everywhere I've looked up that verse, there's a cross reference to a passage in Ezekiel that talks about like a wall that was plastered with some sort of lime type mud, like stucco. Basically, it has a thin veneer on it to make it look pretty, but
hmm.
over time it starts to fall off and such. And Paul, in a sense, just turns and calls the man thou whited wall and tells him God will judge him. I don't
and
see a problem with that.
And also to the point, though, in that same story, when he realizes who the man is, they say, you can't speak that way to the high priest. Then he actually apologizes. He backs down and apologizes because of the man's position. That's
Yeah.
interesting that he would have said it to one person, but he wouldn't have said it to the high priest had he known.
Hmm.
And he recognized the respect of the position if though the person
Yeah.
was
But right,
reprehensible.
yeah. But I don't have a phrase. I don't have a problem with calling somebody a whited wall. So,
No.
if you're gonna use the phrase, I'd rather you say, whited wall than, let's go, Brandon.
Yeah, that's the third option. You can either go kind of the supposedly scrubbed vile term "Let's go, Brandon," or you can be articulate
Right.
and use normal English words, or just pull out some word where you go, You're a whited wall," and
Right.
you're like, "What?"
Yeah. Now,
And they stop.
and now even Jesus used language like that, didn't he? But you have to remind me,
Right?
did he use that language of the high priest, or did he only use that of the Pharisees?
I do
Was
not.
he just referring to all of them?
Yeah, I would say in when he was speaking, say to scribes and Pharisees, not to my recollection did he use it of the high priest, but he'd call them vipers or blind leaders of the
Hmm.
blind. Well, that's
Yeah.
descriptions, to say,
Yeah.
you're venomous, you're deceptive, you're blind, you're unknowing, you're rebellious, whatever. So I mean, obviously, there's terms to use that are true,
Yeah.
but it wasn't a disgusting term of violation on their
Yeah.
physical person or whatever that particular
On another side note,
term.
when he stood before the high priest, when he was actually brought before him, didn't he mostly keep silent?
Yes, yes, he did.
So do you think, am I reading into it to say that he treated different levels of authority differently?
Well, yes, but I don't know if that's exactly the cause or if it was more the timing
I
of it.
see. Okay.
in his final day, being led as a sheep to the slaughter, he was dumb.
Right.
N- you know,
And that's
if it was the timing or if it was the
and that's why I
position.
asked, because I don't want to read too much into it, because it would be too
Yeah.
easy to say, okay, he was willing to speak one way to the scribes and Pharisees, but a different way to the high priest. So he recognized different levels of authority. That would be too simplistic. So, which is why I asked. I
Yeah.
don't want to
Yeah.
read into
Thanks.
it, but yeah, okay. So let's go, Brandon. Probably not a good idea for Christians to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a good
Okay.
idea, in my opinion.
I agree with that.
All right. Good. What about you? What next question here?
Um, This one is maybe somewhat of a philosophical question, but I ask it because I want to discuss it from the standpoint of Christians. So,
Okay.
do you have a basic definition, like a 10-second definition of the difference between pessimism and optimism? This and there's going to be follow-up questions to this. So this is just like part one.
Okay. The first question is, do I have a 10-second definition on anything?
Okay.
No, I do. Can I actually verbalize something in 10 seconds or less? Okay, so pessimism versus, did you say realism or optimism?
Optimism.
Optimism. I guess typically we say pessimism is always looking on the negative side of things. Optimism is always looking on the positive side. Did I get that in under 10?
You did.
Okay.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Take
Thank
note,
you.
people. He can do it. Proof of concept. Okay, so follow-up question to that.
Okay.
And a little bit of context here. We live in a fallen world, right? Where we
Yes.
know as Christians, and those of us that are spiritual leaders as well, those of us who are parents, we know that when we deal with other fallen people in this fallen world, there's a higher statistical likelihood people will not follow our counsel versus follow our counsel, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a higher statistical likelihood that people will tend toward the flesh than toward spiritual things. There's a higher statistical likelihood that people will reject and deny scripture than those who will receive it peaceably and such, because of the nature, the sin nature being what it is, and as prevalent as it is. Does that make pessimism a more realistic outlook than optimism?
I think that's a little. I'd say it kind of depends on the scenario, like what we're talking about. For instance, if we say, I think what stands as realism, and this may be cliche, but is biblicism, in the sense that to see from God's perspective is to say that, and this is the thought that often comes to mind when you talk about saying statistically more people won't listen, or that things are going to go south, or that the world's going to get more evil. I think about the verse, for broad is the way and
Mm-hmm.
wide is the gate, or wide is the
Yep.
gate and broad is the way, where straight is the way and narrow is the gate that leads to
Right.
life, and so broad is the way that leads to destruction, indicating it seems like that there's many people there, where few there be that find the way of
Sure.
life. So that just seems to be a, if you will, a reality, a biblical reality. And yet, if someone says, "Oh, this person, he prayed and he accepted the Lord, and I suppose he was genuine, but there's just no hope for him. He's so messed up," and things like that. Well, again, a biblical perspective is that he can be
Mm-hmm.
transformed, um, and that God, truly can work to
Yeah.
to change his life. So to say, well, he's saved, but he'll never amount to anything. I don't know that pessimism is warranted. But to say, hey, I'm going to go out and evangelize and expect 8 out of 10 people to get saved, that's then
Right.
more of, if you want to say a pessimism is warranted.
Yeah, and I want to be careful not to overdo the characterization of pessimism. So like we view the pessimist as always saying, "Oh, they'll never amount to anything," and that's the pessimistic view. But I think it's just,
Mhm.
I think it's no different than someone saying, well, there's less of a likelihood they'll amount to something. Because if I know, if,
You think that's a
yeah, I
pessimism?
think that's a pessimism, to say they'll never amount to anything, you're overdoing, in a sense, the portrayal of pessimism. Pessimism is just, in
Mhm.
my understanding of it, it's an outlook on something that tends to
Mhm.
consider the negative statistic higher than the positive one.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and we view pessimism often as an
Mhm.
attitudinal problem, where someone is just like, oh, it'll never work, and boo hoo and all this,
Mhm.
all that.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think that's an over dramatized characterization of pessimism. Um,
Okay. Okay. I see. So it's kind of a scale where the negative outweighs the positive, but it's not full on negative
right.
everything.
For instance, someone looks
Okay.
at the creation itself, cursed by sin. Things decay over time. They get worse
Mhm.
over time. Things break and you have to fix them, right? The
Mhm.
pessimist goes to buy a house and all they see is the stuff they're going to have to fix in the future, because they have this outlook that okay, I realize in the world we live in, things break, things wear down. Whereas the optimist looks at the house, almost emotionally so, and says, what a great place to live. And they're often not considering the negative aspect of it at all.
Mhm.
Whereas the pessimist is hardly considering the positive aspect of it. So I think it's a mischaracterization to view these as attitudes. And because the common trope is
I see. Mhm.
pessimism is wrong, almost to the point where pessimism is sinful, right? And optimism is
Mhm.
holy, optimism is right. But yet the pessimist looks at the optimist as being naive, and the optimist looks at the pessimist as being morally bankrupt. I I don't think it's that at all. I think pessimism is just simply looking at the world and saying, okay, the creation is cursed. The sin nature has cursed people's thinking. My own flesh is a problem in my life, and I've seen where all of these things can go wrong. So it is more likely in scenario X that it's going to go wrong, right? So the pessimist prepares for those things that can go wrong. Whereas the optimist, in a sense, doesn't look at the sin nature the same way, even though they realize they have one and that other people have sin natures. They in a sense don't consider the negative as much as the pessimist does.
So the optimist would tend to be more encouraging when you do fall. They would say, "It's okay. It'll you can get over this. You can do better," because they're bringing you back to what they see as
Right.
from their perspective. Where the pessimist is like, "Well, that's what I
Right.
expected."
And the pessimist also sees, well, no, they're probably not going to get over this, because from what everything I've seen about people, they typically don't.
Yeah. So obviously, each one needs to be balanced to a point. I mean, I obviously has some needs to fill out their perspective in a
Right.
way. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think balance is
Okay.
necessary.
Okay.
But the original question is, based on what we know about the sin nature, the flesh, the creation itself being cursed, is pessimism more of a realistic view than optimism, thus making optimism slightly more maybe naive? Is pessimism more realistic considering the world we live
Hmm.
in?
Is pessimism more realistic? That's funny because it kind of brings together the two terms. In other words, is pessimism closer to reality than
Yes, that's
optimism?
the question.
Uh, hmm. Um, in some ways, I suppose some people are like, what? Wait, might disagree with us and we want to hear their feedback at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. But yeah, I think I tend to lean to what you're saying.
Really?
The area where I think of it is, often in politics.
Hmm.
How can we turn America around? How can we change all this? Well, can it be turned around to some degree? I think there's a lot of things that could go on, and the Lord could even bring about, and dire situations in the past where people thought, "Oh my goodness, we're going to be taken over," and then now here we are, decades later, and we've gone through another, period, if you will, of economic prosperity. But if you understand that by and large the people are sinful
Hmm.
and they're not, they're, even when they advocate for moral causes, that's not a consistent view throughout their life.
Right.
Um, so I can appreciate that, the Republican platform still, uh, you know, stands for life, and yet I can also understand that a lot of Republicans do that somewhat inconsistently because they don't really have a moral basis.
Mm-hmm.
Conservatism works for them pragmatically.
Mm-hmm.
It preserves the values that make for a comfortable country, but it's not because things are morally right or that they look to God or that they stand on that foundation.
Right.
It's just what works. Well, if you sort of divorce yourself from God and yet try to hold on to a position for pro-life and for conservative economy and politics, you've really kind of moved yourself off the foundation of what makes sense of those things or how those things make sense. So anyway, I can see that, and I can say even amongst conservatives, there's probably a hollowing out over the years
Mm-hmm.
um, of the moral
Yeah.
core.
It's going in one direction.
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
right.
like, even if there is somewhat of a political conservative revival, as it were, in the country, and people start adopting more Christian values for a period of time, in the big time scale, things are still moving in one direction.
Yes, yeah,
And
that's a
that,
good point. Good way to put it.
yeah, and that we know from Scripture that things are going to wax worse and worse. That we shouldn't expect the world to be trending in a morally upward direction. And I've been thinking about that too recently. You'll often see um, political those who hold political office. You'll see sometimes in people who are kind of turncoats in a way. You'll see Republicans who are acting like Democrats and they're voting for Democratic things, and
Mhm.
they seem to be totally off the platform of what conservatives want, but yet they're a Republican. But yet you
Mhm.
don't really ever see someone on the other side very often
Yeah,
who
right.
who is a registered Democrat, holding political office, and they're voting for conservative things. And I realize there are some exceptions to that, but you often see it going one way and not the other.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think that's just kind of the way the world trends, because we live in this sin cursed world. There's scriptural prophecy concerning the direction the world's going to go, and so on. And that's why I kind of tend to think that when it comes to an outlook, not an attitude, okay, but an outlook of pessimism versus optimism, I think pessimism tends to be more realistic, and optimism tends to be somewhat naive, when we look at kind of the state of creation and the state of the world and the nature of our flesh and so on. Um, yeah, so I'm arguing for pessimism.
Okay. Well, Merry Christmas to all
Yeah.
those. um, all right, that's funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, I could see. Yeah, that's it. Again, glad that we kind of brought it to
Yeah.
that point, that the flow of, if you will, the flow of time.
Yeah.
Um, that it is slowly, gradually, like a stream with a soft current moving one direction.
Yep.
And to recognize that isn't ungodly.
Yeah. Do uh
All right.
do we want to do a patron question here?
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. Let's do this one that came in most recently. This one is
Yeah, I haven't read this one yet.
entitled Christian Cancel Culture. It almost seems like we've
Okay.
talked about this before. But anyway,
Maybe.
here's what he says.
Okay.
The subject is cancel culture and the IFB. The IFB, in case you don't know, is Independent Fundamental Baptists. Um, Question. I recently heard someone insinuate that it's ironic that our churches are critical of the cancel culture since we're the ones who invented it. And our patron says, while that's obviously an inflammatory remark, it got me wondering, what is the difference between cancel culture and the way we practice separation from those with whom we disagree?
Okay. Two things to say here. Number one, we're not going to stand here and defend the way that all IFBs separate, um,
Correct.
and how they do it. Second point to note, and we must have talked about this before, because I recall you saying, and I'm talking about this, not the IFB connected to cancel culture, but cancel culture. The point of cancel culture isn't just to say, I disagree with you, you know, we're not on the same page here. It's basically, you don't follow the party line. You don't spout the talking points. So I want to destroy you.
Right.
I want you never to have a job in your field of expertise again.
Right.
That's cancel culture.
Yeah.
And at first blush, I would say, I don't think that honestly the IFB is quite that way.
Hold on.
Okay. All right. Now I'm more sheltered here. I've been in nicer ministries over the years.
Yeah.
But
And I realize that I'm using an availability heuristic here when I say this. And by
an availability heuristic,
yes,
this is
meaning
what you've
that
seen.
this is what I see from my standpoint. Okay. I haven't surveyed every independent fundamental Baptist church in America. I haven't been to every single one.
This isn't scientific,
This is not
technically data.
scientific. This comes
Okay.
from a personal anecdotal experience. I think I have actually shared this on the podcast before, but I don't remember if it was on the air or off the air. I don't recall. But I have personal experience with being canceled by a fundamentalist pastor, right? I was going to be preaching at a conference, and one of the pastors that was going to be there, he and I had a falling
Found
out.
out that you were my friend, and they said, "Oh, if you're a friend of Daniel, you can't preach." No, I'm just kidding.
No, but it was actually
No,
very
okay.
similar. So I had made friends with another pastor in that state,
Mm-hmm.
and this pastor came in and took a church there in that state. And he's a very conservative pastor. He's very biblically sound, but the church that he took had kind of a history of trending towards new evangelical things,
Mm-hmm.
trying to blend things a little bit. And
And thus had been kind of branded.
right, the church had been branded. He
Mm-hmm.
comes in and takes the church, and his goal was to turn it around, to teach and to preach the scriptures faithfully, to be a godly example of what a separated life looks like. And the church just wasn't really following his lead very well. And because he took this church, other pastors in the state just kind of immediately branded this guy as a new evangelical,
Right.
even though he wasn't, right? And here I am, I'm friends with this guy. So, long story short, another pastor in the state who I knew found out that I was friends with this guy and immediately brands me as a new evangelical. Like just sends me an email just with nothing but accusation, no questions, just accusations. And long story short, the conference I was supposed to preach at, this pastor was going to bring his youth group to this conference. And when he heard that I was the guest speaker, he told the host pastor that if I'm the host speaker, he's not bringing his group. And now the host speaker is in a bind because the host the host pastor is in a bind because here like half of his attendance was coming from this guy's church. But yet he's also friends with me. And he knows I didn't do anything wrong. So he has this choice to make. Either I cancel, Tom Balsamo, or I tell this guy, sorry, then I guess you can't bring your group. Well, he ended up canceling me. And I don't fault him for that, honestly. And I've said this before. I understood where he's coming from. And in the situation, there are other details involved that I can't give. But in the situation, I think he kind of was forced to cancel me. And I don't fault him for it. But when we talked on the phone, we kind of had this mutual understanding that, yeah, I know you didn't do anything wrong, but I'm kind of in this position where I have to cancel you. And I was like, okay, well, I don't hold it against you. It's really him. That's the problem. And so, yeah, I experienced actual Baptist cancel culture. I got canceled. I got disinvited for no reason really at all, other than some guy's, petty whims and juvenile behavior. But all that to say, that is not an isolated incident. I know of other pastors who have been disinvited for similar reasons. And while I want to be careful to say, is there a time when you should do something like that? Yes. I think that there are some guest speakers like we had at our church. Our church was invited to send our young people to one conference, and I knew the guest speaker he was biblically sound, theologically sound, but he has this major attitude problem that is just ungodly and unholy, and he sucks people into it. And people tend to, after being around his influence, they end up very, very angry and negative and spiteful of others. So I thought, it's probably best that, our young people at our church not go to that conference. And maybe next year when there's a better speaker, maybe they can go to it then. So yeah, is there a time when, you should withhold your people from going? Yeah, but I didn't call up the conference and be like, hey, you should cancel this speaker. I didn't do that. Right.
Mm.
But yeah, cancel culture does exist in independent fundamental Baptist circles, though we tend to not really consider ourselves fundamentalists per se. But yeah, it is out there.
Yeah, and that's a whole different discussion as far as the fundamentalist part and things like that. Do we believe the fundamentals? Sure,
Yes.
and all that. But so, although I would have to go back to the original remark that cancel, it's ironic that we're critical of cancel culture since we're the ones that invented it. That's a pretty short sight. Number one, it's a pretty short-sighted view of history.
Yes.
To think that nobody prior to the IFB canceled people in that way.
Right.
Like I can think of Waldensians, hiding in a cave and getting smoked out and getting their heads cut off by, the church, if you will, who is not Christian, if you will.
Right.
That would certainly at least be cancel culture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And that was the predecessor of Baptists today. So prior to, well before IFB was that. And I'm sure that well before that, we could go back to, maybe Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
And
as long as there has
Cain
been people
canceling Abel, it's.
But I think there's a key distinction here. In the patron's question here, he asks, what is the difference between cancel culture and the way we practice separation from those with whom we disagree? And I think you touched on it earlier, but to maybe expand on it a little bit, when we separate from someone, when it gets to the point where we have to separate from someone, it doesn't have to be ugly, and the goal is not to destroy the other person's life and their livelihood. Whereas cancel culture is a graceless culture where they seek to literally ruin someone, to ruin their entire source of income and their entire testimony going forward, so that no one will ever invite them to anything ever again. Cancel culture is graceless in many ways, whereas separation can be done gracefully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm conflating a couple things here, but would we call it, I've heard it called like, the pitchfork mob or whatever, if that's speaking of cancel culture too.
Yeah, kind of.
Where, and going to, I guess, a little bit of your point of graceless, it's, to me, it is, what would be a word? It's without a compass in the sense that, and I'm talking about the cancel culture, because it's so volatile and malleable and unforgiving.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's whatever happens to be the best talking point at the time, though it may be utterly inconsistent with itself in 2 weeks, or something like that. So there is no really bedrock of truth that cancel culture rests on. It's just what, is whatever the social, whoever's driving that is doing. Where I think with separation, Christian separation, there is, at least ideally, a doctrinal base.
Yeah.
And the point is to express that truth and to say, here's our point of disagreement. Now, for some, it's going to be, I don't think violence the way would come across right. The disagreement is strong, in that I might sense this person is a false teacher. They are a wolf in sheep's clothing. They are something like that. So it's not going to be gentle and kind and say, look, if you could just maybe quiet down a little bit, it's going to be a rough separation. Where other people, it's to say, look, when you when you joined this body, you know, you agreed together with us to abide by this statement of faith. And this act, gives us a black eye and is a poor representation of Christ and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And we have to separate. We can no longer do this. But a point, of course, is by the separation to bring the person to repentance and bring them back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not to make them grovel to us as people, but to see them, to cause them to see the truth.
Right.
Where in the cancel culture, you grovel, you apologize for something that wasn't even wrong,
Right.
and then you're still kicked to the curb, and it doesn't
Right.
really matter.
Exactly right.
And so there is some difference. Now, again, the way some people in quote unquote Christian people. Now, I'm not doubting their Christianity. I'm doubting the way that they're handling it. Do they handle it a Christian way? No, not really,
Mm-hmm.
or a wise way. So you brought out that. I thought that was interesting. So you kind of brought out that distinction where we could have both said, "I'm not going to that speaking engagement. I'm not going to that. What'd you call it? I'm blanking out on the
Conference.
word conference. I'm not going to that conference." But the one said, "If you don't cancel that person, I'm not coming to the conference." The other one just didn't come.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I guess if the pastor would have asked, "Hey, why aren't you going to be able to make it?" Just say, tell you the truth, brother, I'm not comfortable with this speaker here, but there's no demands put on it per se. Anyway, that was a different approach. And so, to the person's remark, has he seen Christians vilify other Christians? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And does that look like cancel culture? Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
And does it resemble it? Mm-hmm. So,
Sure.
but to cast that upon all of us, and again, that goes back to the IFB. It's just kind of funny to me. All you IFB. Well, there's no such thing. That's the I of the IFB is independent.
Yeah.
Is that we're unique structure, and so to say that every independent church out there is this way. Well, no, not necessarily.
No.
Are there some sweet spirited kind, doctrinally sound, godly ones out there? And are there ones that are more fleshly and hyper authoritarian? And well,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. You're going to see that distinction. And so, anyway.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, I think there's some interesting side conversations that can come from that, which we might have to take into the after show.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yep.
one of them would be, what role do discernment ministries play in this perception of Christian cancel culture? You know what I mean by
Mm-hmm.
discernment ministries, or
I do.
ministries of
Mm-hmm.
warning.
Yep.
I've got a blog post coming out soon about, a warning about warning ministries. So, just to tease it a little bit, I think there's some interesting things about them that maybe people have always wondered, why does this feel weird and gross? What's wrong with this? This article hopefully will shed some light on why it feels so strange. Though I think there's a place for such a thing in a certain way, but that'll be coming out hopefully this week sometime. But I think that's a related discussion to this Christian cancel culture thing that we ought to take into the after show.
Yeah.
And
that sounds good.
yeah. Boy, so much more could be said about that. Yeah.
But we are pretty much at the end of our time and need to go for today.
Yes.
And so we'll just have to save some more questions. But we always do like to hear from you. Any questions that you have, any thoughts about, just rattling around in there about any aspect of life and how it connects and what would be a Christian way of thinking about it. We'd like to hear your thoughts, your comments, your questions at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, and if you would like to join us on the after show, like I said, there's some more things on this conversation that need to be said, and we're out of time to say them. So if you want to hear them, you've got to go over to patreon.com/reasontogether. We need you to become a patron. You. Yes, you. I'm talking to you. That's right, you. Patreon.com/reason together and become a patron there at the elite level, and that will get you the after show. But any of the other levels are good too if you've got other perks that you're interested in. That's patreon.com/reason together. Anyway, that's all that we've got for this one. We'll see you on the next episode. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.